It looks good. I can see everything. I can hear you clearly. So
Okay.
Dr. Tanno just popped on. There she is.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you guys?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. You have a good weekend? You do anything cool?
Nothing too exciting. Went for a walk. It's starting to get pretty hot outside. We got this like splash pool, inflatable splash pool thing for the kids. So, that's, the most exciting thing they've been doing this summer so far.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to like come up with creative things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
How are you feeling?
I'm good. Yeah, just in the office today. So
Yeah.
Seeing a few people, but not too many.
Yeah.
And that's about it. I guess that's this weekend our neighborhood pool opened up. So I decided to go see what it was all about. And it's good. Actually, I was surprised. They limit it, you have to sign up for a slot. They limit it to 50 people.
Yeah.
You have to wear a mask. You have to, there's all these rules, basically. The clubhouse is not the clubhouse, but the little indoor section is basically closed. So it's, I felt actually pretty distanced from people once I got there.
Yeah. Are you right up until you can't, or what's your plan?
Yeah. So I'd rather not, yeah, I can send you an email later, but yeah, I'm working until like the middle of August.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's see. So we have a few people signed on. So we'll give people a few minutes. Are you seeing a lot of people making appointments related to
This topic?
well, yeah, I guess so. I think probably with COVID, but with the I don't know what you want to call it. What do you call it? Race issue sounds nice, but anyway, are you seeing an increased discussion of that in your videos with people?
100%. Yeah, I've had several people that are solely coming, with feeling very stressed about this issue. Sometimes it's, difficulty dealing with a family member who sort of has a different belief system, perspective on it. And I'm certainly talking about it with the vast majority, if not all of, the people that I've already been seeing, no matter kind of what their skin color is, it's been very relevant to people.
Yeah, I know. I think we're seeing, I'm definitely seeing then people who have gone to the protests who are now anxious that they have COVID because they were so it's like a chicken and the egg, right? It's like one stresses you out, so you do something about it, and then you just think about it. Now it's the other thing that stresses you out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let me just, since we have a few people on the call, let me just make an announcement about Wednesday. So for those of you guys who are on the call, most of you probably know me by now, but I'm Dr. Tanno. I am doing these, organizing these webinars and then moderating them. So today we have Dr. Park. We'll come back to introduce her. And then Wednesday is Dr. Mahmood is a oncologist with the Maryland Hematology Oncology Group. We've had a few of their doctors come out and talk to us. So those of you who saw the genetics talk with Dr. O'Connor, and then last week, one of their other doctors was a colorectal surgeon. Dr. Patil talked about common sort of bottom issues, as he called them, sort of common hemorrhoids, fissures, pain, that kind of stuff. So this is a third doctor in their practice who's an oncologist, hematologist, and he's going to talk a little bit about anemia, which is when your blood count is a little bit low. And so in adults, when they have anemia, it warrants a whole investigation. Usually nothing comes of it and it's all normal, but the things to look out for. So he's going to talk about some myths and misconceptions around anemia. So that should be a good talk. And then Friday is July 3rd, so the office will be closed, so we will not be doing webinars. And then I think our office is going to start opening up to some appointments mid-July. So I think at that point, we're probably going to slow some of these webinars down, might go down to one a week. I have to sort of figure this out, what we're going to be doing, just because it's hard to balance when you have patients in the office with these lunch talks. So stay tuned. There's going to be some changes for sure. The question of what exactly they are, I'll let you guys know when I know. But otherwise, today we have Dr. Park, Stephanie Park. She's one of our clinical psychologists. So sometimes when you or Dr. Moskowitz, who's our other clinical psychologist, talk, I just give a little background on, I guess, maybe you can actually give it, and you can even wait till the end if you want. But, you know, when people are looking for some kind of a therapist or someone to talk to about mental health issues, there's a lot of different people to look for. There are PhDs, there are licensed clinical social workers, there are PsyDs, there's all these different degrees. And so sometimes it helps to understand what the difference of training is, but I can leave that to Dr. Park. And if you want, you can talk about that at the end. But she has a PhD in clinical psychology and does therapy in our office with our patients. And today she's going to be talking about some of the stress around COVID and the race pandemic as well. So I'll let her have the floor. More people will probably join in the next few minutes, but let's just go ahead and get started. And then if you guys have questions, sorry, Stephanie, if you guys have questions, go ahead and submit them to the chat or the QA section, and then we'll go through them, I think, at the end. But the more questions you have, the more exciting this discussion is. So go ahead and send them in.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Tanno. And since I can't see the chat box myself, please feel free to jump in.
Yes, I will. I'll read them out as they come.
Okay.
Do you want me to interrupt you with them, or do you want to wait till the end?
Yeah, that's fine. Please feel free to interrupt me. I think that kind of gives it a nice break in terms of just, I don't want to be talking nonstop. And since I'm doing this myself, it would be nice if you could, you know, anytime jump in with your own questions, comments. That would be great. So my role,
I'll be listening.
Okay. So my role largely at RIMG is to help people address their mental health needs. I frequently see people with depression, anxiety, stress, insomnia, and, you know, suffice it to say that 2020 has kept me very busy. With COVID, certainly people have had a lot of issues dealing with worries, the lack of uncertainty, departure from their sense of normalcy. So that has been really stressful for people. And, you know, right when it seemed like folks were starting to find their footing and adjust to this life as we know it, you know, everything with George Floyd happened. And that has stirred up a lot of difficult emotions for people. And so the genesis of this talk is really to provide a space for kind of discussion of this topic and how to deal with it from a psychology perspective, because it is something that's impacting mental health. So kind of that's where I'm coming from. And also just on a personal note, this is a topic that's kind of very near and dear to my heart. You know, I grew up in a town right outside Newark, New Jersey. So I was born in New Jersey, born and raised, but my parents are immigrants. And so, you know, race has always been an interest of mine in terms of kind of how we relate to one another. And so, you know, growing up in that town in New Jersey, it was extremely diverse, you know, Black, brown, Portuguese, Filipino, lots of, you know, different races, ethnicities. And then when I was in middle school, my parents, you know, they had this thing like, they're going to save up money. We're going to go to this supposedly great school district. And so I was thrust into a very different world where, you know, it's Dave Matthews Band and everybody, I don't know if you remember Dr. Tanno, like the double popped collars. So it was just a very, very different world. And then when I went to college, I lived in Baltimore for several years and did a lot of my graduate school clinical training in Baltimore, where I think you did a lot of your medical school training, right? So you know that it's a very diverse area, the vast majority of Black and African-American patients. And then now I'm in Potomac. So it's kind of been this like yo-yo back and forth for me. Yeah, that's kind of a little bit where I'm coming from. Okay. So,
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, it's interesting how you don't need to go that far. I went to the University of Virginia for undergrad, and I grew up in Bethesda, and it's not so much a race thing, but it's more of just religion. I'm Jewish, and my roommate, who is from Stafford County, Virginia, which really is probably like 45 minutes south of here. It's not even that far. Had never met a Jew. I mean, it was like, you know, and I still remember she asked me, she was like, she was taking a religion class and she asked me, she's like, Eleanor, do you celebrate Ramadan? And I was like, you mean Ramadan? And she was like, yeah, whatever. You know, that was her response. And I said, well, that's not my religion. Like she had never met somebody. So I think, I mean, that's a religion as opposed to a race. But my mom is also an immigrant. She's from Israel. And so, you know, you know, we go to restaurants, even to this day, we go to restaurants and, you know, sometimes the waitress or waiter will ask me, you know, what did she order? I can't understand anything she said. And it's sort of like, we're speaking English.
oh my gosh. Yeah.
It's just a variation of English. But yeah, so yes, I mean, it's amazing how you go 40 minutes north to Baltimore, it's totally different in race. You go 40 minutes south to Virginia, you have a totally different makeup. To go that far to meet people who have never met anybody like you or have met very few people like you.
Right. And a lot of what it really boils down to is that, you know, people don't know what they don't know, you know. And it's interesting that people just, if it's the world that they've grown up in and that's their bubble, oftentimes the only messages they get about other cultures, other races is what they see on the media and movies. And so it's almost, you know, we see other people as caricatures of what they really are, you know. Yeah, really fascinating. So today, I really, you know, I did struggle a little bit with exactly what I wanted to cover, because certainly there are entire textbooks written on this topic, you know, entire undergraduate courses. And so to kind of boil it down to just a few things that are, you know, relevant to race and psychology. So I wanted to talk about racism and effects on mental health, understanding racial identity, and to come at it from a very academic perspective of looking at a specific model of white racial identity and what that means for people. And then certainly to talk about, you know, how to process and cope with everything that's going on. We see the protests, we see the way that things are covered in the media, and it's really stressful. So that's the focus for today. And apologies in advance if it appears that I'm glossing over certain things or not addressing it. It was just, you know, for the purposes of this webinar, just wanted to select a few things to focus on. So I don't think I need to necessarily define what racism is, but I wanted to delineate between two different types of racism. So there are racial macroaggressions, which are, you know, usually the type of racism that come to mind when we think about a racist act. So these are the overt forms of racism, you know, calling somebody the N-word, you know, telling somebody to go back to their country, being physically assaulted or killed due to the color of your skin. You know, the prototypical KKK, burning crosses, in your face type of racism. But the reality is that the vast majority of people, especially Americans, are not overt racist, right? What's more prevalent, and I might argue more, you know, difficult to deal with, in fact, are the racial microaggressions. And this is a term that I hadn't heard until I was in college, and I think many people are not so familiar with this term, but basically, racial microaggressions are the subtle, intentional, or more often unintentional slights that demean people of color. And this abbreviation, BIPOC, stands for Black, Indigenous, persons of color. And the example that you gave, Eleanor, Dr. Tanno, before we started the talk, when you said that, you know, a waiter at a restaurant might say, oh, I don't understand anything she's saying, you know, even though she's speaking, your mom is speaking English. You know, I think Dr. Moskowitz and Dr. Council gave a talk a week or two ago on implicit biases. And that's, you know, at the crux of a lot of these racial microaggressions are, what are our beliefs, even unconscious, about certain groups? And so for oftentimes Black African-American individuals are thought of as, threatening. They're thugs. If they wear baggy pants or something like that, that somehow it's assumed that they must have a criminal background. All right. A very common one that I've heard with for many of the people of color that I've worked with clinically is, someone saying to them, "Oh my gosh, your English is so good," or you're so articulate, you don't sound Black, and so even though it's acting as a compliment of sorts, the undertone really is, wow, how can you be, dark-skinned and intelligent or articulate or educated? And these subtle slights are very difficult for people to confront and deal with. One that I've gotten a lot in my lifetime is, where are you from? And then, I always say New Jersey. Then it's no, where are you really from? As if I couldn't possibly be, American, or I must be from somewhere else because of the color of my skin. And clinically, I learned when I was dealing with patients who asked this, to ask them back, why is that important to you? So I thought I was getting smart with that kind of question back to them. But when I was in Baltimore, one of the veterans, who I actually didn't even know, he wasn't even my patient, but he was down the hall and he shouted at me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Okay, why does that matter to you? Why is that important to you?" And he goes, "Well, I like to ask all foreigners where they're from." And so that I hadn't heard that response before. That kind of stopped me in my tracks. But, the underlying message again is like, you're not really part of us. You can't possibly be truly American. You're not from here. And so again, it's not an overt act of racism, but over time you can see how these things add up, and they do tend to affect people's mental health, sense of belongingness, and feeling that they are comfortable living in this country, that they're always seen first and foremost by the color of their skin. In terms of the mental health effects of racism, many studies have looked at the relationship between racism, these macroaggressions and microaggressions, and depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms as well. It's really interesting, this idea of racialized trauma or racial battle fatigue, that many people of color have symptoms almost PTSD-like. When they tell me that I feel like I'm always on guard or hypervigilant. I have this one very lovely client who says, even though she's lived in this neighborhood of Potomac for many years, pretty, I'm sure, well-to-do neighborhood, she doesn't feel comfortable walking around outside because she feels like, people will wonder, oh, does she belong here? Or she has to, make sure she's dressed nicely. She can't just go out in sweats and flip-flops. That she has to make an extra effort to appear friendly. It's really sad, to think about how somebody has to live with that mindset, and you can't even say anymore, "Oh, you're being irrational." It's not an irrational fear or anxiety. It's become very clear that these are real issues that people of color have to deal with. There's also research looking at physical health effects of racism, and data suggesting that people of color often experience things like headaches, higher blood pressure, due to being the targets of overt or covert racism. So really, the physical and mental health effects have been well documented when it comes to racism. One aspect of racism that I wanted to also focus on is what we call internalized racism. And so this is different than, structural, systemic racism or being the target of somebody else's racism. But internalized racism is when the person of color begins to absorb, accept, believe, and apply the demeaning racist beliefs to themselves. So when the person of color begins to have lower self-worth, lower self-esteem because of what's going on, the pervasive messages in their society. Do you remember, I think it was Dr. Council who in that talk, the webinar she gave a few weeks ago, she gave this example of this young Black boy who was on an airplane with his mother. And, he said, "Mom, look, it's Daddy," and she turned around and she said, "No, that's just the only other Black man on this plane. It's not Daddy." And his response, the young boy's response was, "I hope he doesn't rob us."
Yeah, I had actually shared that was from a TED Talk.
Oh, that was a TED Talk. Okay.
Yeah. And it was, so then she went on to talk about all our implicit biases, but I know, like you said, it's internalized. I mean, I can't imagine he was 3 years old at the time.
Yeah.
How many associations he had to make in his head to come up with that statement. Like, he looked around, he saw one man who was Black. He saw no other, no one else. And then he, had to say, "Oh, that's similar to Dad." And then he had to come up with this racist statement, which I'm sure he didn't mean from his heart. He just had the association.
Yeah. But that to me was a really stark example of, the beliefs that get internalized for people of color is that it really starts to limit the way that you see yourself and other people like you. So internalized racism, other huge examples, gosh, are, you look at beauty ideals in communities of color, right? So, for the Asian community, you go into any type of drugstore, convenience store, and you see skin whitening products, right? It's everywhere. Everybody wants their skin to be lighter. And Black and brown communities, colorism. There's a oftentimes preferential treatment for people who have lighter skin colors. I've had many clients of color who will say that, my parents treated me worse than my lighter skinned sibling, which again is incredibly sad to think about, So we have colorism, we have, in the Asian community, I don't know the exact statistic, but many, I'm sure, dollars are spent on cosmetic surgeries for double eyelids. Is that something that you've ever heard of, Dr. Tanno? Oh, I think you're muted.
I was like trying to find my mute button. Yes, I have. I have. I'm trying to think. I actually feel like I've only done one pre-op appointment for somebody who was going in for that, but I think she was telling me that in parts of Asia it was much more common than in the
Yeah. So in China, Korea, in a lot of wealthier families, it's, people don't even bat an eye at it. Oh, pardon the pun, but basically it's like considered a rite of passage to cosmetically create a double eyelid so that the eyes appear more, European, white, bigger, and that's seen as the ideal, the expectation that you should strive for. And in a lot of Black and brown communities, you talk about hair and how much money is poured into, Black women spending money to get their hair to look a certain way, and in essence to kind of hide, ethnic traits. And all these things put together, you really start to see, wow, the ideal for many is kind of to hide what's ethnically, the way that your eyes might look, the way that your hair might look, to strive towards, this concept of what's beautiful. And again, that speaks to this idea of internalized racism.
And then I was just thinking when you said that, and I'm sure you hear what you were saying with people having, voices or traits that are not characteristically Black or more white. How people say, "Oh, you're acting white," then that's offensive, because if you grew up in a certain kind of culture, you just act the way that you grew up. If it happens to be, what is expected of a white person versus a Black person, then it's sort of like, and that's a comment that I think I didn't, I heard that a lot in college with, girls, acting white, and then and now looking back, you think, okay, that's an offensive comment, but there has to be sort of this enlightening process to realize that that's an offensive comment.
Yeah. And so I don't know if everyone can see the slides. I don't know if anybody just calls in, but this quote is from Steve Biko, and he was a South African anti-apartheid activist in the 60s and 70s. And his quote is, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I thought this really nicely encapsulates the idea of internalized racism. Okay, so this next slide is one of the models that we learn about in clinical psychology, and this was developed by Janet Helms, who's a PhD psychologist, and it's the white racial identity model. And the bubbles on the left are not as important. You don't have to, get hung up on what the exact words are. But the overall message here is that racial identity is really, the understanding of one's racial identity is really a journey and a process. And this specific model applies for white people, and then there are different models, different theories on people of color. There are even models for, people in the LGBTQ community, but it's a way that psychologists sort of understand kind of where somebody is along the process of understanding their racial identity. So here we see that in the beginning, oftentimes, the first stage, contact, is really this color blindness approach to life that, I don't see color, we're all the same, and here people are often dismissive, or even further than dismissive, really anti like talking about race, right? So like we shouldn't talk about race, like that makes things worse, or talking about race actually creates more racism. And I don't do anything racist, so I can't be a racist. So this is often the first stage of understanding racial identity for people. And oftentimes this is because people might grow up in communities, Dr. Tanno, like you mentioned, in which it's so homogenous that they are not exposed to people of color. And so you don't know what you don't know, right? And then the second stage is marked by feelings of guilt and shame for being white. And this is oftentimes when people are initially confronted with racist acts that have happened to people of color, and they start to think, oh gosh, okay, I guess racism does exist. And they start feeling badly, and feeling hopeless and stuck in many ways. And from there, people can go into the next stage, which is reintegration. This is marked by feeling defensive. And we see a lot of people kind of stay at this stage, right? So, it's not my fault, I'm white, the proverbial, hey, I have a Black friend, or I have a Black neighbor, or, my coworker's Black and I'm friends with him, so I can't be a racist. And getting really defensive anytime that, race is brought up, or even the idea of white privilege is brought up. People in this age get very, very defensive. And then we have pseudo-independence. So the pseudo-independent stage is seen as the first sort of step towards positive white racial identity. So in the pseudo-independent stage, an individual recognizes that there is privilege based on skin color, but still there's a large reliance on Black, Indigenous people of color to be the ones to address racism. So people in this stage recognize that there's white privilege, recognize that racism exists, but kind of stands in the background and lets the work of anti-racism be led by others. Okay. And here it can feel very frustrating because for many people you recognize there's a serious issue going on in our country, but you feel I don't know what I can do. Right? I'm just one person. Where am I going to affect any type of change? And it can feel like you're kind of just very stuck. And then immersion and autonomy, we see individuals begin to better understand their white racial identity and embrace it, that what it means to be white, while also working alongside to fight racism, to confront oppression, and to work towards equality is what we see with immersion and then autonomy. So again, I don't want people to get caught up in, the exact names of these stages, but the real takeaway message is that, understanding one's racial identity is very much a process that can come with a lot of different emotions that people can struggle with.
We have an interesting question here, and to be honest, I don't know if I can answer this. So the question is, what's the fine line between a genuine compliment, such as "Where are you from?" or "Your English is good," from someone who wants to start a conversation? So I think, just to keep this in mind, I think we all, just as a, just a comment, right? Like, we comment on people's physical traits before anything else. And so, this is in some ways, I understand wanting to start a conversation, but I think I don't know. How would you answer that question? So I could share my thoughts later.
Yeah. So let me repeat it back. So you said the question is, what's the difference between like a compliment, like, you're attractive, or your English is good. And then what was the last part of that? Sorry.
So, and somebody wants to start a conversation. So I think sometimes people just comment on things to try to get things something. But I guess, how would you guide somebody who is just really a little bit unsure where the line is?
So I think where maybe possibly what I'm thinking of is that oftentimes these microaggressions, like, commenting on someone's English or their appearance, comes from a place of curiosity, right? So if somebody has not been around many people of color or Asians or Jewish people, you might just be genuinely curious. I've had a lot of my clients that I work with who are Black will say, people want to touch my hair, people want to ask me about my hair. And I don't think it's coming from a place of malice, but it's coming from a place of genuine curiosity. But the effect of that is that the person of color feels like, okay, am I like a sideshow? Am I, like an animal in a zoo where you're kind of like gawking at me? And so that can feel very like otherizing, and by that I mean like, well, you're different from me, and that's the way that you see somebody. And so that's why as a person of color, it feels off. Even though I can probably recognize that you're not intending it to be negative, it feels like, okay, well, that's the first thing you think of when you see me. And what I would suggest is, hey, if you want to start a conversation with somebody, I wouldn't start it from a place of racial difference, right? Like, you can ask somebody, what do you like to do? Or how's the weather? Or, like other things that don't make it so that, oh, I'm like just gravitating to this idea that you are racially different from me. And there's a difference between saying to somebody, hey, you have a really great smile, versus, you're pretty for an Asian, and so not making it about race, I think, especially if you're a stranger, because then the question I also wonder is like, why is that important to you to like know where I am from? Like, if we've never met before, does it really matter to you what country my parents are from? It just feels like it's a weird kind of fetishizing type of question or comment. Does that sort of answer the question, Dr. Tanno?
I think, the answer here is, this is a very tough question to answer. I get a lot of from patients, how old are you?
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not the same as a racial question, but it's sort of, when you hear it enough times, it grates on you, because it's like, why do you ask? I've been here, these kinds of things. So I think maybe in this case, think of race as, it's somebody's physical body type. So in the way that you wouldn't comment on somebody's, belly, right? Or somebody's butt, or somebody, you wouldn't, that's not something you would say to somebody at a bus stop, like, wow, that belly must have taken you years to develop. I think, whereas some maybe comment more on, if you're trying to comment and start a conversation, just understand that when you comment on race or English or something like that, you know, these people have heard those questions thousands of times in their lifetime. And so if you just harmlessly want to start a conversation with somebody, you know, comment on something about what they're doing or about what they're wearing. You know, I like that top, or that's, you know, your beautiful dog, or that bag that you have. I mean, start there, because that's a safe thing to chose. I think that's, you know, but it is, I agree with you, it is hard. I think you have to understand also, just like for people I know, like, you know, like I was saying with my mom being from Israel, I mean, I can tell you how many times people ask her, where are you from, and her accent and everything. And she's been here since she was in her late 20s. And it's like, how many times a week does the poor lady have to answer that question from strangers in the grocery store or something? So I think if you're going to comment on it, just know that it's not an original question, one. And maybe comment on something that person chose about themselves, like what they're wearing or what they're doing, rather than how they were born. And then somebody had to answer a question. I guess something got cut off. I'm not entirely sure. In your presentation, about immersion or autonomy stage, I guess. Can you just maybe go /2?
Sure. Yeah. So immersion and autonomy are quite similar, but basically in these stages, the individual, the white person, begins to really embrace and accept their white racial identity, and see that that's not something that you should be ashamed of. You know, it's not that, you know, all white people are at fault for racism and you should feel bad that you're white. No, it's that, you know, what is your background represent to you? What does your family ancestry represent to you? And to be proud of that, while also recognizing that that does afford you a place of privilege, and to work alongside people of color to fight for equality, and to fight against systems of oppression. And so in immersion, the person is beginning to do that. And then in autonomy, you're really embodying that. So those are the last two stages.
And then I don't know how many, do you have a lot more slides? Would you rather keep going, or do you want to take some questions?
I'd be happy to take questions. Yeah, I have like 2 more slides, but I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Why don't you finish your slides? Because if you only have 2 more, then we can be done, and then we can open the floor.
Sure. Okay. So this slide is really targeted for what do I do about all this? You know, everything that's going on. How do I be part of the solution? And so a few things that I've listed here. So first is to really identify and label what you're experiencing, what you're feeling. And this is for, you know, people of color as well as for white people, whether it's feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling helpless, hopeless, that, you know, you're feeling these emotions for a reason. And, you know, I mentioned George Floyd at the beginning, but the unfortunate truth is that, you know, he wasn't the first, and unfortunately, don't think he's the last, right, of you know, events that have happened in our country that have been, you know, very racially motivated. So, you know, the sense of sadness is really pervasive, and a lot of people of color that I've worked with and talked about this with over the past few weeks, there's also a sense of skepticism, right? So, okay, we see all this media coverage, all my white friends are talking about it, and I see people on social media like showing solidarity, but, you know, are things really going to change? You know, when the next big news thing takes over, are people just going to forget about this, right? So that feeling of skepticism, that feeling of, yeah, I don't want to get my hopes up, of kind of, yeah, we've seen this time and time again. I think to certainly, you know, validate those emotions. Listen. You know, it sounds so simple, but that's really something that we don't do enough of. We can't even begin to kind of heal this country and take steps forward if we don't really stop and listen to what's going on. And that's that defensiveness that I mentioned, in the previous slide, when it comes to a certain stage of racial identity, is that people are very uncomfortable talking about race. And oftentimes people feel very defensive. They feel like they're being attacked, that their integrity is being attacked, that they're being called a racist. And I think that when they get defensive and immediately it shuts down the conversation, you're not hearing what's really happening, and you're not really coming at this from a place of openness. So I really implore people to really listen to what's going on, even if it feels uncomfortable, because it's going to feel uncomfortable. But to really take an active effort to hear people out and what their experiences have been, rather than dismiss it. And that also makes me think of oftentimes the people of color that I've worked with, they get you're making everything about race, right? Or the angry Black person, narrative, right? And that's very difficult, because then it feels like damned if I do, damned if I don't. If I don't say anything and nothing changes, but if I do say something, then I'm labeled this angry Black person who's making everything about race. So I think the more that people can really listen with a non-judgmental openness, the better off we'll all be. And this goes along with the listening, but educating oneself. It's not your fault that you are white, right? But what you can do is really understand, what it means to be white in this country, and what it means to be a person of color in this country, and how those life experiences can oftentimes be vastly different. This is not to say that as a white person you have not struggled, or that you haven't had to work really hard for what you have and where you are, but to understand that there are systemic issues that contribute to inequality in our country, and to educate yourself on what is the experience of a person of color. And there are so many amazing books, podcasts, documentaries, Netflix specials. If you just do a quick Google search, many things will pop up. And I have a slide later to talk a little bit more about resources, but I think educating yourself is a really important thing.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would add to this, and maybe you were going to get here in your bullet points, to try to surround yourself with different people. I know that sounds really I don't know, cliche or something, but we've all been, if you, I don't know. I mean, it's not that it's easy to make different kinds of friends. I mean, obviously that's not an easy task to go do,
right.
But maybe get out of your bubble, meet somebody from a different background, and that can be any background, because that could be a socioeconomic background, that could be a race background, that could be a religious background. I mean, anytime you meet more people, you learn something from them.
Definitely. And, research has shown that one of the best predictors of decreased racism and discrimination is contact with the out group, contact with the other group. And as I mentioned before, when you don't have contact with that group, you've grown up never having met another Jewish person, or you've grown up, with an all-white school, all you're left with when you think of, a minority group is what you see in the media and movies. And so it becomes a caricature. Black people listen to rap, and they, play basketball, right? Which is there's so much more within group difference than between group difference, and we don't know that if we don't get exposed to people of other cultures, races, ethnicities, to really learn that, there's so much more that makes somebody human and similar to us than, one would think just based on skin color differences. Good point. And I don't think I had that as a bullet point, but thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Tanno. I think being open to feedback and being mindful of defensive feelings. One of the things that makes it difficult for people of color to talk about race is that they don't want to cause an argument, upset somebody. And I think being open to feedback and, accepting that, hey, there might be times where even if I don't intend on saying something offensive, that maybe what I did kind of make somebody feel some type of way, right? So that microaggression that we talked about, unintentional majority of the time, but still something that could be hurtful, right? Okay, and this is kind of the control what you can control type of thing, right? So whether we're talking about COVID or what's going on with race in our country, but what do you have control over in this situation, right? So I talk to people about what are the conversations you have with your children, with your family and loved ones. I really think that the more that we can have to really be thoughtful about how we raise our children and the messages that we give them about race and other being with other people of different backgrounds is how we really start to change what's going on in this country. This is a long-term process, but really a lot of it has to do with the things that we say to our children and the things we say in front of our children, even if we don't think that they're listening. Like, how do you talk about other groups with your spouse, right? So kids who are very young, pick up on these things. Research has shown that even kids as young as 1, 2, 3 years old understand that people look different, right? So there's research that shows that kids as young as 2 years old show preferential play with same race children. So even if they don't, consciously are verbalizing anything to do with race, they recognize that that's a construct, right? That's something that exists. And this is one topic that, some of the parents I've worked with have struggled with is whether your child is white or a child of color, like how and when do I talk to them about race? And I don't want to take away their innocence. I don't want to scare them and tell them too much about what's going on. But you also don't want to be this naive, ostrich in the sand of, hey, my child doesn't see race, la, 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 la. It is important to talk to kids at a developmentally appropriate level about issues like fairness, about issues, equality, and treating each other well. So again, developmentally appropriate. You can have a little bit of a heavier conversation with a teenager than you obviously would with, a 5 or 6 year old. But I think that's something that I encourage people to think about. Calling out racism when you see it. And this is something that, we would like to think is a no-brainer for people, but it is so incredibly hard. I think about that show. Have you seen it, Dr. Tanno, like the What Would You Do show, where they have actors do something, I don't know, like out there, and they see how people react. And oftentimes, when you're the audience and you're sitting there watching the show, you think, oh my gosh, well, I would say this and I would intervene and I wouldn't let that happen. But many a times, when we're out there in the real world, it's a lot harder to intervene, right? You kind of might be caught off guard, or you don't know what to say, or you don't know, exactly how to help in the situation. So calling out things like racism are difficult, especially when the perpetrator might be somebody you care about, right? So how many times have, honestly, your friend made a racist joke and you kind of laughed along, right? Or, a coworker said something really inappropriate and you just kind of, and like, I'm not going to sit here and say, you need to be, this like political correctness police and correct every single person that says anything remotely inappropriate. I know that there's a time and place, but I encourage people to certainly be more thoughtful about kind of what the people around them are saying or doing. Yeah. And then kind of the put your money where your mouth is, right? So supporting minority-owned businesses, donating to social justice causes. A lot of times this is what some of my clients who are doing because they feel like, okay, with COVID, I don't feel comfortable going to a protest or a rally, or I have young children, I don't feel comfortable, bringing them there, but, I will get takeout from this minority-owned restaurant, or I will contribute money to, to certain causes that I support and feel passionate about. There's a whole long list of things that you can do. I'm just highlighting a few of them here. And then another suggestion that goes along with dealing with COVID pandemic stress is really limiting the amount of news and social media that you expose yourself to, especially prior to bedtime. right? So for obvious reasons, it can be really upsetting. You see people going, Twitter wars back and forth, Facebook wars back and forth, and it, what did that get us, and so really kind of limiting how much of that you expose yourself to, and it can often feel like, catastrophic end of the world type things, certain headlines. And then also kind of paying attention to the positive, right? So, with everything that's going on, it's not all just doom and gloom, but it's also people coming together, people showing solidarity, people showing incredible resilience, and seeing children, make signs, and that's something that's really encouraging and gives people hope, and looking at areas of progress. Okay, so this last slide here, I had a few, just in case I didn't know where our discussion was going to take us, but a few kind of prompts, to think about. One, what were the messages, both explicit and implicit, about Black, Indigenous people of color with which you were raised, right? Why is it so difficult for us to talk about race, to call out microaggressions? Why are there such disparities in mental health treatment and utilization in communities of color? And then the very difficult, if my spouse, if my mother-in-law, sees things very differently than I do, what do I do about that? The Thanksgiving dinner table, like what's going to happen, right? Or social media, do I respond? So these are some of the things that I thought of, but I'm happy to talk about any of the questions, Dr. Tanno, that were brought up by people at this point, or certainly if you want to chime in, please.
Yeah. So I actually put a book recommendation in the chat section. So I read this book, I don't know, maybe within the last year. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration. And, there's tons of books out there now to sort of get you going. But this one in particular is about the migration of Blacks from the South. They follow 3 different people. So it's all true stories, but 3 people basically out of different parts of the South. One's a peach picker in Florida, one's a Black physician out of Georgia, and then one is, I think he's from more middle, like Mississippi. But anyway, and how you had this spread, and how they ended up in cities, and how the cities segregated and they ended up in these neighborhoods, and then this, basically like how did we get these urban centers of Blacks that have, worse resources than the surrounding white suburbs. Basically, it was systemic, designed, maybe not so, it was conscious, yeah. So anyway, there's tons of books out there, but I thought that one really changed my perspective of how I look at things. So I think if you're curious about this topic, which you guys all are, because you're here today, definitely, reading, talking, all those things that Dr. Park just went over on the previous slide. Those are all things you can help to just sort of open your world a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great book suggestion. I hadn't read that one. And I listed a few more here. Now, the ones I put on this slide are very psychology based, because gosh, there's like hundreds of such good books on this topic, but I wanted to kind of pick ones that are coming from a psychology realm. So most of these are either written by psychologists, or just have a lot of, psychology themed things like, understanding, Black mental health, or understanding how stereotypes affect us. I also put in there the implicit association test, which was something that you can do for free if you just Google implicit association test Harvard. And this is something that Dr. Moskowitz and Dr. Council talked about. You can sort of see, like, what are my implicit biases on a number of topics, not just race. That's something just kind of eye-opening, right? And then I like this one, the 4th one. So you want to talk about race, and that's because, that gets at why it's so difficult to discuss these topics with people, and how can we do so in productive ways. So that's a helpful one. As is the next one, the race talk and the conspiracy of silence, understanding and facilitating difficult dialogues on race. So I don't know, should I leave it on this slide or the previous one with the discussion questions?
Wait, show me the previous one again. Let me see what. Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. I don't know. Both of these could be one. Maybe leave the resources up because I think we just have 2 minutes here anyway.
Okay.
I want to write that down. And remember, guys, all of these are recorded. And if you go to our website, the COVID webinar page, you can click on the links and you can always find this. So it's not like it's gone forever. But just maybe there's a few questions here, but let me just read a few quick this is more of a comment.
Sure.
So this is from a patient who I assume is a patient of color, but I don't know.
Okay.
The perceived racism affects how I, in particular, approach my medical practitioners. I trust their medical expertise, but assume they see me differently and may or may not understand how my ethnicity affects my life.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably true. But I also think that, we also, in the way that we might see a much older patient, we always describe these 90-year-old women as these sweet old ladies, like as if something magical happens when you turn 5 that makes you a sweet old lady, right? That's also medicine, or like, so I think there's a lot of biases in medicine. You'd like to think you're not one of the biased there, but yeah, that's it. It is good to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
As the patient and the provider, that there are biases there.
Yes, and there's a large body of research. Sorry?
Oh, and I just said what's important is that we're talking about it and we're thinking about it.
Yeah, and to that person who posed the question, there's a large body of research that shows that medical professionals can and do have certain biases, even unconscious when it comes to treating people of color. There's data looking at how women are treated postpartum care, and Black women versus white women, and the amount of pain management they get, right? Or, that's something that I would say the vast majority of medical professionals would not be consciously aware of, right? But it is something that happens. And some of my people of color that I work with have really commented on the fact that they appreciate how RIMG does hire providers of color, and that they feel comfortable when they walk around, that it's not just all white faces looking back at them, and that does make a big difference.
Okay, guys, I think that's pretty much all we have time for, because we have to run off we have patients at 1. But if you have questions, you can. I think that these are. I think today's talk was mostly to get your minds going, really. So, I think if you're interested in this topic, look at these books, talk to your friends, get involved with causes, get involved with different people. You'd be amazed how just knowing one friend of a different color, or somebody who has a different sexual orientation, getting to know those people, it really can change your perspective of, what those people or that group is like. It's amazing how just even knowing one person really well who's in a minority changes perspectives. And that's all I have to say. Dr. Park, do you have any last minute thoughts?
Can I make 2 last minute thoughts?
Yeah.
I will keep it under a minute. So one is that the best way to deal with these feelings of stress, anger, hopelessness, sadness is to take those emotions and to not be complacent with it, right? So how can I use that to fuel, doing something productive, affecting change in my immediate, community and broader. So to not feel complacent with that. And then the second thing I'll say is, thank you for those who have kind of tuned in and listened. I really truly appreciate it from the bottom of my heart, and that's shows a willingness to listen and learn something, and to sit with a topic that's uncomfortable oftentimes. And I think that the fact that you are listening now really goes to show that you want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Just a quick question here. Somebody said how to contact Dr. Park for further information. So what's the best? It depends maybe what your question is for her, but would you prefer scheduling a visit if it's something personal? Would you prefer if they're just looking for resources, portal, or what's your?
Yeah. So
advice
certainly
there.
I'm happy to, if you want to schedule a visit, I'm happy to meet with you. But if you just had sort of a question on this topic or follow up on something, I'm happy. Am I able to give my email address out or have people send me a portal message? I always respond to those. Yeah, if you can send me a portal message or send me an email. Is that okay to put out my email?
Yeah, the other thing is that with these, when you guys get your email from Privia about where about the next link for the chat or for the next webinar, at the top there's a paragraph that just says like, thank you for continuing to listen to these talks. In that paragraph, there is an email address listed. It's like webinars at RIMG. And so yeah, Vanessa, who's one of our staff members, monitors that chat, but if it's particular to some thing, she'll forward it to either me or if you just wanted to send a question to Dr. Park.
Great, yes, that would be the best. Yeah, send me a message.
That way it's an email. And then and then there's another question here I just want to answer super fast. A patient just asked, where's the best place to find a prior webinar? I just put the link in the chat. The best place, the only place to find them is you go to the RIMG website. So if you honestly put in Rockville Internal Medicine Group into Google, you'll get our website. And then there's on the homepage, there's a link to the COVID webinars. And if you click on that at the bottom of that next page, it'll take you to, there's a list of all of the past webinars and the links to the YouTube video for them. So, all right, I gotta run, but thank you guys, everyone, for listening. I'll see you on Wednesday with Dr. Mahmoud about anemia, maybe not as philosophical, but definitely interesting in its own right. And thank you, Dr. Park, for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care, everyone.